Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. Last week, I released part 2 of my coverage of 16th President Abraham Lincoln. At the end of the episode, I mentioned that I was not quite done and that I planned on welcoming a special guest to the show to discuss Lincoln's legacy and leadership. I am so fortunate that fellow podcaster and presidential history expert Jerry Landry agreed to help me wrap up my coverage of Lincoln. Jerry is the host of the Presidencies of the United States podcast, where he dives deep into the history of past administrations. He is incredibly thorough, and I appreciate his nuanced approach with his coverage of presidential history. Once you've wrapped up this episode, I sincerely hope you head on over to Jerry's podcast and give him a listen. I'll be sure to put information about the Presidencies of the United States in the show notes of this episode, or you can search for Presidencies wherever you stream your favorite podcasts. We recorded our conversation over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. Enjoy, friends. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is Jerry Landry from the Presidencies of the United States podcast. He has so graciously agreed to chat with me about one of the largest looming figures in American history, President Abraham Lincoln. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you so much for having me, Alicia.
Thank you so much for being here. I knew I wanted to have you on, given your knowledge, your thorough research, and your balanced approach to presidential administrations. But before we get started, please tell the listeners all about you and your fabulous podcast.
Absolutely. So the Presidencies of the United States is my podcast. We've been going since 2017. I try to release at least every 2 weeks. And even with that, with over 200 episodes, in terms of the main narrative series, I am only on the presidency of James Madison. If that gives you any clue as to how much of a deep dive I do into presidential history. But my premise has always been that the presidency isn't just about the one person who is chief executive. There's so many other individuals, events that go into shaping and reshaping what the presidency is and the success or failure of each of the presidencies. So I do the deep dive. I have special series around the lives of cabinet members, vice presidents. There is so much to discuss just in what we've covered thus far. And I am so grateful for an opportunity to kind of hit fast forward for a little bit and talk about Lincoln, because it's going to be a bit before we get to him on presidencies.
Definitely. And we've had a conversation, I've had you on before, where you got to fast forward a little bit and we talked about Andrew Jackson. You're just now starting to scratch the surface of Andrew Jackson, the military man, in your current presidential series. So I always appreciate just how thorough and how deep of a dive that you go into, because like you said, you can't really understand the administration without understanding all of the moving parts. And I think when we look at somebody like Lincoln, we can't really understand the moment, how important everything was without understanding all facets. And so your expertise, I think, will come into play. And I can't wait to have this conversation with you.
Likewise.
All right. So like I've said, you have spent more time than anyone I know studying the nuances and details of our country's presidents and their administrations. So how does Lincoln rank for you in the list of men who've held the title of Commander-in-Chief?
Well, it's funny. Every time somebody asks me who my favorite president is, I feel like it's cliche to say Lincoln, and it is Lincoln. And for so many reasons, there are those presidents who faced crises that just seemed insurmountable. And you see like FDR, you see people who face these crises. I mean, even George Washington, technically being the first president, there was absolutely no manual for him to follow. And the nation could have fallen apart. And there's a reason that these folks constantly are at the top of the rankings. And there's a reason why Lincoln is typically number one, just because the country was falling apart at the seams. Everything was collapsing. And here you've got this guy from Illinois who had very little political experience, who comes in and he provides leadership and confidence, but it's with humility.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that he can't do it alone. In fact, that's the whole point. He knows the folks that are still there, he's got to bring them together. And we've all got to work together to preserve the Union. And he does it. And the fact that he does that in this crisis like no other president had ever faced, and arguably no president since has faced, is just astounding. And so, of course, he's number one.
Yeah. I know when I was thinking about it and debating it, I was torn between Washington and Lincoln, and to a certain extent too John Adams, right? Like I feel like Washington was such an important figure in the fact that he demonstrated that you need to be able to step back from power and let the country move on. I think John Adams kind of taught us how to kind of be magnanimous in defeat and understand that the republic needs to move on in when there's a shift in power and ideology. But then you have Lincoln, who's kind of, as you're saying, he's at this precipice, right? The country is on a cliff, and it can go one of two ways, really. And how committed he was to trying to safeguard the Union, and how thoughtful he was and purposeful. That's why I'm always torn between those three gentlemen. So I refuse to rank them, but. Yeah, no,
it is your podcast, so you can refuse to do so.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And so thinking about Lincoln and kind of his actions to try to preserve the Union, how did he balance preserving the Union with his commitment to ending slavery during the Civil War?
Well, and I think that gets to where all this starts for Lincoln. Lincoln's purpose at the beginning was solely on preserving the Union. Mm-hmm. And, you've got that quote from Lincoln: if he could save the Union and free all the slaves, he would. If he could save the Union and not free a single slave, he would. It was all about preserving the Union. But as time went on, he realized, and that's one of the amazing things about Lincoln, as you study his presidency, you're studying somebody who is in turn studying and learning. He realizes what the nation needs, and he realizes he has to step up. He has to learn about military tactics. He has to learn about what's going on. He has to learn about what is going to allow the Union to take down the Confederacy and bring these states back into the Union. And he realizes ultimately that's the problem: slavery, and this slaveocracy that is so pervasive, really not just in Southern culture, but in the culture of the United States. And that was the problem. That was exactly what the Confederacy said that they were going to war to preserve, was slavery. And so if that's what they're going to war to preserve, that's what we have to end. And he realizes economics. You've got to strike people where it hurts. And then he starts to get to the place, and you start to see an evolution in him, that he's starting to see, this is about more than just economics. This is about people. Mm-hmm. And especially as he starts to meet Black soldiers and starts to realize their commitment to the Union is just as strong, if not stronger, than his own. And you see a person evolving. And so by the end, it becomes part and parcel. But at the beginning, it was just solely about preserving the Union. Slavery was something that existed, but it took him a bit to realize that in order to preserve the Union, we had to do away with slavery.
Yeah. Well, and I just got done reading John Meacham's biography about Lincoln. I think it's called "And Let There Be Light." And Meacham takes a kind of an approach of it's kind of a religious awakening within Lincoln, that
Mhm.
his conversations with God, his deepening relationship, kind of in religion, that helps kind of propel this thought process. But in watching Lincoln's evolution, I think you're right. It started very much as kind of an economical thing. Like, we cannot win this war on our own. We need reinforcements. Why would we ask African American men to enlist if we're not going to give them anything in return, right? And
Yeah.
so that's where he goes, initially with that Emancipation Proclamation, and then he evolves over time to kind of see, yes, they are worthy men and they should be allowed their freedoms. To give it kind of a contemporary example or comparison, it reminds me a little bit, his evolution reminds me a little bit of Barack Obama, President Obama's stance on gay marriage, right?
Yeah.
Originally, he was no, 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 that's not something we're going to talk about. And then, slowly through kind of his own internal learning and having conversations and reevaluating, he got to this place where he said, no, we need to actually move forward with this. This is just the right thing to do. And I think that's probably one of the things, in hindsight, that so many people appreciate about Lincoln, right? Is that he had the ability to continue to move. He wasn't immovable. He was not going to stay on a position just because he said that 6 months ago, 6 years ago. He was somebody who was willing to continuously re-investigate or interrogate kind of his thought processes. And you want that from a politician. You want somebody who's not
Yeah.
stagnant, right? So just kind of an amazing individual in that he could be so self-reflective and move forward, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and then you've started a special series which focuses on members of the cabinet. So you talked a little bit about your podcast about the presidencies, but I want to give you a chance to really talk about this members of the cabinet, as I've been on there a couple of times to talk about cabinet members too. But you've started now kind of exploring and investigating the members of the cabinet and how they contribute to administrations. And so you might not have gotten super deep into this research yet, but of what you know, what do you think made Lincoln's cabinet different than those that came before it?
Well, it's interesting because, Alicia, you see in some cabinets that came before this idea of bringing in like a rival or a major figure in the party. Lincoln's cabinet was really composed of a lot of the people who challenged him for the Republican nomination in 1860. You've got William Seward, you've got Edward Bates, you've got all these figures who loom large in this new party. And Lincoln and his supporters were able to achieve victory, get the nomination, and then ultimately the presidency. But this gets back to that idea, that chief idea in his mind of preserving the Union and realizing we've got to bring the disparate parts of the party together because we've got to present a united front. And so he brings in these figures, and it's sometimes a challenge. Salmon P. Chase was notoriously difficult in his cabinet, and Lincoln realized the importance of keeping Chase close, to make sure he wasn't doing any damage out in the world. It was this idea of keeping your enemies close. And you see it work. He was able, and especially like Seward. You see Seward, and Seward by this point he was a skilled politician. He had been around for decades. He was seen as being this leading figure in his own right, and it didn't take long. He went in kind of thinking, oh, well, Lincoln's this bumpkin. We'll see what happens. And he quickly realizes, oh no, this is the guy.
Mhm.
And once he gets those key cabinet members in place, they are critical, and he started with Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania as his Secretary of War. Cameron had some corruption going on, and so he's quickly ousted. And then you get Edwin Stanton, who had previously served in Buchanan's cabinet as Attorney General. And again, like not necessarily the person that you would think of for that role, and he was the perfect person for that role. And so these cabinet members really helped contribute. They really help Lincoln to be able to not only think through what's going on, how do we fix this, but then also with their political connections, he was able to say to Seward, hey, can you talk to your friends in the Senate? Can we get this moving? They would know senators, congressmen, they would know the folks that needed to be brought to the table in order to make things happen. And that was the key to the Lincoln cabinet. I can't wait to finally get to some of these figures because there are some amazing characters in his cabinet. And it really gets to the core of what Lincoln was all about, which was bringing everybody to the table, keeping a united front, and winning the war.
Yeah. Well, I think you put it pretty astutely when you were saying, he wanted to make sure he brought all the different people from the different parts of the country, because he realized he didn't win with this huge sweeping majority of voters, and how smart of him to say, okay, I know that I am nobody's, I'm not the majority's favorite choice here. I'm very limited in the power that has been bestowed upon me. How can I kind of temper expectations or temper the kind of the flames here a little bit? And I think again he makes a very smart decision in saying, I'm going to bring people that maybe disagreed with me to make me better, to give me different perspectives, so that when I'm trying to do something in this moment, I have kind of all perspectives at the table. And when you think about that, right, like that is the foresight in that is pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you see it in not just the individuals that he brings in, he brings in one of the Blairs, and the Blairs are this major family, slaveholding family in Maryland, but he knew he needed them too.
Right.
He needed to keep the border states in. He needed people like the Blairs to be able to build this broad coalition to preserve the Union. And you even see him, and that's one of the amazing things as you study Lincoln's presidency, because he would have times that he would be talking with somebody and he'd kind of, okay, well, yeah, we'll explore that. He didn't really intend to explore that, but he needed them to think, oh, well, he's taking it into account. And then he would do what he needed to do once he could do it,
Right.
and he was very much the strategic thinker. He knew sometimes he just had to keep the plate spinning until he could really spin the right plate to really get things done. And it's, that 4+ years was just every day was a balancing act
Mhm.
every day. And his cabinet was at the core of that.
Yeah. Well, and you touched on this a little bit in your previous answer in terms of just having the connections and being, the right players at the right moment. But curious, do you have any other ways that you think that Lincoln's cabinet really contributed to his success as a leader during the Civil War?
Well, and I think Lincoln realized, like many of the greatest presidents in American history, you've got to have the right people, and you've got to have people that you can trust, or at least trust far enough, And yes, Chase, we're looking at you. But he had to know his folks, because no one president can do everything on their own. And especially when you're faced with this all out war, there was no way that Lincoln was going to be able to do this alone. And you see the size of the government, you have to expand the army, you have to expand, the supply functions of the army, you have to expand the navy, you have to expand all of this. You've got to collect more taxes, so you've got to expand the treasury. There's so much the government had to swell in order to prosecute this war, and he had to have the right people at the table. And I think that he, even if he didn't get the folks initially, he found the right people to be at the table to help him to do all of this and to help him, because you see folks like, and you mentioned John Adams earlier, his first cabinet was just awful, just absolutely awful. And he had to spend so much time double checking them, doing things behind his back, and they were doing things behind his back and having to deal with all that drama. And if you're doing that as a president, you can't really be president. You're trying to do somebody else's job. Lincoln didn't have that luxury. He knew that he had to have folks who could give him the space, knowing that things would be taken care of. They were going to handle it. If he said, do this, they were going to do it, so that he really could be the president.
Right. Well, and I think too, in this kind of heightened political climate in today, it might be a hard question to try to wrap our brains around. But, so much of what Lincoln has been celebrated for is his ability to kind of bring these disparate types of people together, different perspectives, different thought processes and experiences. And just thinking about our current political moment, what lesson can today's political leaders take from Lincoln's administration and who he chose to take on in his cabinet?
I think you've got to build a broader coalition, and especially considering that we are basically a two-party state, we've got some smaller third parties, but they're nominal in terms of the actual apparatus of governance. And so you've got to build this broad coalition, but what does that look like, and how can you find people that you can trust? And that's a challenge. And especially with the 21st century political landscape, because we see this some with earlier administrations. And case in point, I'm especially thinking of James Monroe's cabinet. Over half the cabinet wanted to run for president once Monroe retired. And so nowadays you've got these folks who have ambitions to something higher. How can you work with those ambitions, keep them on track, and make sure that you can trust them? It's hard. Also, I think one of the things that is a challenge today is, just like you were saying earlier, Alicia, we should want people who change their mind, who learn and grow and say, you know what, even though I thought this 6 months ago, a year, 2 years ago, I've learned something new and I want to change. In the current cycle, the way politics work, if somebody changes their mind, if they say something that's completely different, everybody between the regular media and social media jump on them. And it's like, don't you realize you want somebody that's going to grow? You don't want somebody to just stick with the same viewpoint, even if they know it's wrong, to be consistent.
Right.
And things change. I mean, that's one of the realities of life, is that things change, circumstances change. If we are really going to have leaders who tackle the big problems that we have nowadays, we're going to need people who learn and grow. We're going to need people who are able to build those broad coalitions, who are going to be able to bring folks to the table. And I think that's one thing as citizens we can try and do better, is not immediately jump on, oh, well, why are they talking to so-and-so? Well, because so-and-so may need to be at this table. They changed their mind on this. Well, maybe they've learned something new. We want that. And it's tough. We're conditioned in these ways. social media, just media in general is so pervasive. We've been doing this for a while and it's not working.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the few things that people across the political spectrum can agree on is that the way we're doing politics right now is just not working.
Yeah.
So we've got to do something better, and we've got to encourage leaders to be more like Lincoln and change and bring disparate folks to the table and try to solve the big problems because no one person can do it alone.
Very well put. I think, my biggest takeaway from Lincoln and trying to apply it to the current moment is we have to get to a place where we can talk to each other and
Yeah.
hear what each other is saying. We're not always going to agree, and there are some things that, we're never going to agree on. But politics historically has always been about compromise, right? You're going to get a little bit of what you like and a little bit of what you don't like, and hopefully the majority will kind of push whatever we're, slowly but surely gonna push the country in a better place. But we can't do that if we're stuck in silos. And I think that's probably one of the biggest pitfalls, I would say, of our current moment, of our current technology. I love technology. It allows me to do my podcast from my little home studio. But there are these silos that I think have just become more and more entrenched and have shortchanged any conversations that might be possible in a different type of environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what makes Lincoln wonderful. Let's talk about some of the difficult decisions that he had to make during the war. So, what are your thoughts on his order suspending habeas corpus?
That is one of the points of Lincoln's legacy that is difficult to reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
It was a wartime measure, and I don't think it was a decision that he was happy with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if he could have found another way around it, he would have. And he realized this is just what he had to do. And this was a point, and you have to wonder just for all of us what we would do in that circumstance. You've got state after state seceding from the Union. You've got Washington, D.C., that's surrounded by slave states, one of which has already left the Union. The other potentially could do so as well. And then we have to abandon the capital. What do you do to ensure that Maryland doesn't secede from the Union? And it was a difficult choice. You've got the other border states and that's the thing, each state that would leave, it was another nail potentially on the coffin of the Union. And that was Lincoln's whole focus, was preserving the Union. And so I think it was a difficult choice. And I think there are arguments to be made that maybe there was another way. But from his perspective, I think Lincoln would say he couldn't see another way. And so he made the hard choices. And there are those points in Lincoln's legacy that, and it's really with any president. Presidents have to make hard choices. That's what we elect them to do. When they don't make the hard choices, James Buchanan, and things start to fall apart, that's when we've got a problem.
Right.
We can argue about Lincoln, whether he should or shouldn't have suspended habeas corpus. We can argue that now because the Union was preserved, because Lincoln did his job. And I think that Lincoln would say, yes, I take the blame for that. Mm-hmm. He would take ownership of it. And that's, to me, that's what makes an impressive leader, even if I don't necessarily agree with their decisions. If somebody's willing to take ownership instead of playing the blame game of, oh, well, it was really so-and-so's idea or whatever. And I don't think Lincoln would have done that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think he would have definitely owned up to that decision. And it's one of those things in history, right? We don't know the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened had he not suspended it. We don't know, in that moment, operating with the information that he had, where would you have made a different decision? You don't know. Um, Again, not to compare things, but I compare it to the decision to drop the bomb, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely some significant concerns and arguments that you can make about that was not the right call to make and list all of the kind of the impacts and ramifications. I think also that there's a counterpoint to be made of. So in that moment, Truman, what information did he have? And did he make that decision based on the information in that moment? Would he have made a different decision had he had different information? We don't know, right? We can only go off of what was decided. So I think you put it very astutely in saying, it was all in preserving the Union. He was very worried about the other states seceding. This was for him kind of the only final last option he had to try to safeguard as many of the remaining states as possible. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's what we want presidents to do. Even if we disagree with the decision, we want them to make those decisions. We want them to really think through what is needed in the moment, given the information that they have. And I have no doubt that there have been presidents and will be presidents who, on down the line, they learn something new and they're like, well, maybe I could have done something different. But again, I think that one of the things that makes Lincoln one of the greats is that he was not afraid to make the tough choices and to own up to it and say, this is what I did for better or worse, and here's why.
Yeah. And so, shifting a little bit, Lincoln was assassinated just days after the surrender of the Confederacy. So, how do you think Reconstruction would have gone differently had Lincoln survived?
And this is one of the biggest what ifs of American presidential history, because we know, Andrew Johnson came in, he was abysmal. He was just letting states in willy-nilly. Oh, well, I think you're fine now. And there have been arguments made that that was more of Lincoln's policy. And we see some documentation, some suggestions that that would have been how Lincoln would have approached Reconstruction is, a very, low bar, just, say you're not going to do it again. Let's go ahead and bring the Union back together. And that was one of the things, like with Lincoln, his concept and what he pushed, and I think what he had to push, instead of saying the Union had broken apart, he didn't recognize secession as legal. These states were not apart from the United States. They were still a part of the United States. But I don't think that Lincoln would have gone to the extremes that Andrew Johnson did. And especially if there was this backlash, as we see in Reconstruction, I think Lincoln would have seen that as wrong and would have seen that as being something that just, and especially Lincoln knowing how much he thought of the soldiers and how much time he spent getting to know the soldiers. He took this very personally because he knew these were people's lives. They were giving their lives for the Union. And he would have seen it as, not honoring their lives and their sacrifices to just say, we're going to go back to the way things were. I think he recognized that things were going to have to be different. And I think he would have pushed for that.
Right.
What that would have meant, we can only speculate. But I don't feel that he would have gone quite to the extreme that Johnson did. At the same time, I don't think he would have been, and I think he would have pushed back against some of the radical Reconstruction leaders in Congress and some of the ideas that they had. I think he would have found, and like Lincoln did throughout his presidency, I think he would have found a middle way.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think knowing he was the kind of the guy that tried to stay the middle of the road, tried to very thoughtfully consider everybody's opinions and their experiences, and just where he had evolved on the issue of Black Americans. I don't think he would have been super radical Reconstruction, but I don't think he would have been as conciliatory, I think, as Johnson was. And it's always one of those, what would have happened? I think more so than even Kennedy, and I know Kennedy's kind of the more modern example of what could have happened. But I think as important as Kennedy's administration was, it kind of pales in comparison to where Lincoln kind of got stopped short, and what could have happened had he been granted the remainder of his term, and hadn't been assassinated. So I think you put that pretty beautifully. Now, as somebody who has studied all of the presidents, you have a whole library that I'm staring at. We're conducting this over a Zoom interview, and I'm looking at your presidential library. Always so jealous. What would you say is the most common misconception about Lincoln?
I think people tend to think that he was pushing, and even in his own day, there were concerns, and that was part of the reason for secession, was this concern that if Lincoln was elected, he would do away with slavery. And that's not necessarily the case. It's how things ended up because of wartime necessity, but that wasn't what he came into the presidency seeking. But I think both in his time and in the modern era, there's this idea that he was always for emancipation, and he wasn't. And that's something that I think it's important to understand, because there's so much misconception about the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement in the 19th century, that it was, oh, well, these folks always felt that everybody was equal, everybody should be equal, they should have equal rights. And no, that's really not the case. It was much more complex and nuanced, and there was a whole lot going on there, because they're humans just like us, and we're nuanced and complex, and we're a mass of paradoxes and contradictions walking around every day. And that's what makes people amazing to study.
Right.
And especially historical figures. I think that we do a disservice if we just try and paint them with one brush and one stroke, and, oh, this was it. No, they're more complex than that. And in studying them and in studying the complexities of leaders of the past, like Lincoln, it helps us to preserve their humanity and helps us to connect to them as humans. They're flawed. They made mistakes. They changed their minds. They grew, hopefully. Some didn't. But Lincoln, in cases that we've talked about, he did grow as an individual in this process. And that just makes so much richer history for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think the more we know about the human side of these quote unquote great men from history, the more accessible they are, the more you can understand them, and hopefully the more you're kind of you can connect with them. And I agree with kind of your assessment of the biggest misconception. I think it was, so, and I think too it was a product of how he passed away, and when he passed away, right, they wanted to canonize him, and he was the great emancipator, and that lasted for several decades. But I think historians have done a pretty good job of kind of trying to pull back that and give it a little bit more nuance. But yeah, I think I would agree with you that that's probably his biggest misconception.
Well, and you had mentioned JFK earlier, and just like with JFK, you have Jackie, who is crafting this idea of Camelot and this mythos around Kennedy, in order to preserve his legacy, but B, being able to preserve her place
Right.
in history. And likewise with Lincoln, there was a reason why this mythology, this mythos of Lincoln, the great emancipator, came about. The Republican Party ran on it for decades as the party of Lincoln. Oh, remember the war. And we see these bloody shirt campaigns. They keep coming back to that. And Lincoln is a rallying figure for decades in Republican Party politics. There's a reason why they created that mythos, and it was for the good of the party, the
Right.
party to be able to move forward. So and that's also interesting to see, like, with these myths that develop around presidents, why? Is it because there's some benefit to somebody or some group that there is this mythology? Or is it that somebody is using this, and I'm thinking of like Parson Weems and the cherry tree myth with George Washington. There's a reason why he wanted to get his name out there. This was, his claim to fame. Oh, well, we're gonna mythologize George Washington. I'm gonna sign up for this bandwagon. Everybody loves Washington. They'll believe all this great stuff about him. There's a reason why these myths develop.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of knowing that the Civil War is a pretty significant challenge to any administration. And I think we've touched on a couple of modern examples of comparison. Can you think of any other president who faced a similar hurdle and how their response was maybe similar or different from Lincoln?
Well, of course, the obvious is FDR,
Hmm.
and FDR, of course, he's he's his own kettle of fish. He's at the point that World War II develops. At that point, he had already been president for 8 years. It's he was already an established figure. He came into the presidency as an established figure in Democratic Party politics. And still, this was a major challenge. This was
Mhm.
something that it was a challenge unlike any other that any other president had faced. And I think that he had to do some of the things that Lincoln did, building coalitions, bringing in people from not just other parts of the Democratic Party, but he brought in Stimson, he brought in Frank Knox, he brought in these folks who were Republicans into his cabinet. And he brought them in because he realized everybody had to be united to face this challenge. He also, like Lincoln, had to experiment a bit and had to learn more. And it didn't always work. And he didn't always have the right commanders in place. He had to play around with some of that. And when he got the right commanders in place, he did everything he could to make sure that they had everything they needed in order to win the war. And it's similar to the approach that Lincoln took. I think he was at more of an advantage coming into it just because he already had that established political experience, and he was a Roosevelt versus Lincoln, who was just this guy from Illinois. He could pick up the phone and call anybody, and also technology was much more advanced then than
Right.
Lincoln had to deal with, but somewhat similar in how he had to approach the war.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned FDR. You kind of stole my answer because that was that was who I was thinking of too. And you went to the war. I went to kind of him being elected during the Great Depression, right? And here you have thousands of people unable to work, who are ready to work, can't take care of their families. And how do you kind of save the country from itself? And there's not a clear answer, right? And I
Yeah.
think historian Eric Rauschway wrote kind of an investigation and an interrogation into like New Deal policies and FDR, and he makes the argument basically that the New Deal policies kind of saved America from itself and saved it from kind of encroaching fascism and what others were looking at as other political systems that might benefit them more by the success of the New Deal. And then obviously later with their success in World War II. So, yeah, definitely, I think as close of a parallel as you could possibly make, knowing with a big asterisk, nothing is as historically important as a civil war. But I think in terms of just the severity of the moment and having to deal with 1,000 crises at once and not entirely and new, right? Like the Great Depression. Yeah. Yes, there had been recessions and there had been economic downturns, but nothing to this magnitude in the country's history. And how do you fix that? How do you right that ship? That's such a challenge. You have to think creatively. And so, yeah, I agree with you. FDR, I think, is probably the closest that we would get.
Well, and also just like Lincoln, he made controversial choices.
Yeah.
You know, like Lincoln had suspending habeas corpus. With FDR, you see the internment camps. You see this growing spy network. You have people going into people's mail. You have the surveillance that's stepping up. You have all these questionable things. I spoke, I think it was last year, with David Beto. He wrote a book about some of the darker legacies of the New Deal and the wartime efforts, and it was fascinating, and it speaks to, again, this idea that people are going to make hard choices, and whether we agree with them or not, we've got to explore that. We've got to see, was there another way for them to have achieved this, and why did they feel that they had to do this? And so, just like with Lincoln, there are complicated parts of FDR's legacy to explore.
Yeah. There's a book coming out by a Dr. Anthony Gregory. I just started reading it because he'll be coming on the show here. Spoiler alert, everybody. And he's writing this whole book about how the New Deal really was the starting point and kind of the solidifying moment of our police state as we know it. And that, prior there was all this lawlessness, and there were legal codes on the books, but really crime was dealt with as like a private matter. There was no systemic kind of approach. The FBI wasn't the FBI at that point, but the FBI was still pretty toothless. And he's making the argument that it was part of the New Deal and this coalition that really helped solidify what we now know as kind of our current police state, for lack of better phrasing. That's not the right word to use. But so yeah, to your point, right, with all of the roses comes several thorns, and there's that nuance again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so how can understanding Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War inform our approach to political leadership and governance in the present day?
I think it goes back to, and again, I think there are some strong examples from Lincoln's leadership. I think that this idea of being able to have those conversations, and even if you agree to disagree, having different people at the same table, or at least have them in the conversation, I think that's important. I think it's important to realize that we may not have all the answers right now. And especially Lincoln, that's one of the things that I often reflect on with Lincoln. You just have to imagine him going into the executive mansion and the first day, and what do I do? Where do I start? Because it was a monumental task. Where do you start? But I think it also speaks to, sometimes you just got to start somewhere and try and realize that you're going to make mistakes and that we're going to fail, and hopefully learn in the process. If we're persistent in trying to meet our goals and trying to do what we think is right and just, we'll get there. But it's not all going to be done in one day. And I think, especially given some of the problems that we're facing in 21st century America and the 21st century global environment, we've got some big, overwhelming issues looming. We have things that, just like Lincoln was facing, the problems come from a legacy of just kind of kicking the can down the road and, oh, somebody will figure this out at some point. And then it just gets to the point where, okay, well, we've got to deal with this. We're facing some of those right now. And we've got to take heart in facing these issues, not just pretending that they don't exist.
Right.
And we've all got to work together towards it. It can't just be one person. It can't just be one group of people. And that's one thing with politics. That's always a danger. And, then as now, when you've got folks who promise you the moon and you're like, how are you really going to do that? Do you actually have a plan? We need to be a little more critical about that and realize that if somebody says, I'm going to fix this big problem and it's going to be easy, they're probably not going to do that. They're probably not going to fix the problem.
Yeah. Well, your answer kind of segues perfectly into the final question that I have for you. And we discussed this. So not only are you doing a deep dive on presidential administrations and cabinet members, but this being an election year, you've also taken on the monumental task of producing a couple of episodes that really investigate the impacts of some pretty significant elections. And we talked about the election of 1860 on your show a few weeks back. And so we talked about how Lincoln was in office during a very critical turning point in the nation. You mentioned kind of in your response just now that we're kind of at a critical juncture again. And many historians have indicated that given recent events, we are again at a significant crossroads. So do you see parallels between 1860 and today?
It's funny, and I had a guest on a while back, and we talked about this idea of history repeating itself. And his answer was that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it echoes.
Mm.
And I think we're seeing some echoes now. We're seeing certain things that we thought were better than they were. And especially, racial injustice, discrimination, prejudice. We have a legacy in our nation that is an awful cancer. And it's eating us alive. It is keeping us from being the nation that we could be together, all together. We've got to face that. We've got to face a world where we're not necessarily the one superpower telling everybody else what to do. And we probably shouldn't be.
Right.
We've got to learn how to work with others. And I think that starts with us. And, we've mentioned earlier in our conversation about this polarized politics, and it even goes beyond the political realm. It's in society, it's in culture. We are polarized in a way that in some ways I think we were, and we just didn't realize it. And I think it's being exacerbated by this pervasive social media presence in our lives. And there are no easy answers to any of these and more, because we haven't even talked about climate change. We haven't talked about all of these other things that are looming over us. And I think Lincoln would tell us that we've got to just keep going. Right. We've got to keep trying to be persistent, to do what we think is right and what we think is best and what we think is just, and realize we're not going to get it right.
Right.
Realize we're not going to have all the answers. There's a humility to that. And if we are, to have and preserve this republic, we've all got to be in it. We can't be apart from one another. We've got to be a part of the solutions that we need. And therein lies the challenge. And it's understandable why people feel separated and isolated and feel like this nation is against them and people and society are against them. It's understandable. It was understandable in Lincoln's time. Why should any African American feel that the Union was there for them when they and their parents and grandparents and great grandparents had been enslaved by the leaders of the nation for decades and
Right.
centuries? And Lincoln realized that was what had to happen. They
Right.
had to be engaged. Everybody had to be engaged. And it's not going to happen in one day, but I hope that, and especially work like you do, Alicia, with Civics and Coffee, engaging in the civic conversations and bringing people together and talking about things, trying to understand and make sense of our legacy in terms of history and where we're going from here. I hope that your listeners will take that to heart and take this knowledge that they gain from your podcast and from other podcasts that they listen to and anything else, any information that they take in, and they use it as what it is. It's a valuable tool to be able to build something better.
Yeah, very well put. And I think to your point, we only get to live up to the promise of our country when we all are engaged and we all participate. And I think that has historically been my message to people who are frustrated with the current political climate, and who say, well, what's the point? It doesn't matter. If voting didn't matter, why would there be so many people dedicated to making it so difficult for you to do? Right?
Exactly.
You have a tremendous power when you step into that ballot box, ballot booth. And I just hope, as frustrating as politics can be, and as angry as we are, and as many demands that are on adults' time everywhere, that we take a moment to recognize that we all have to be in this together. We have to talk to each other, and you have to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Jerry, as usual, this was a fabulous, fabulous conversation. I feel 10 times smarter just from spending this last hour with you. So thank you so much for coming on. And before I let you go, please, 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 I brag about you all the time on my social media, but for those who do not know or have not yet found you, where can they find Presidencies?
Absolutely. And likewise, Alicia, thank you so much. I always enjoy our conversations. I love being able to encourage you to do a little more of the deep dive. It's always nice to have you on Presidencies when we can really just geek out to history. I know you love that. I love that. So it's always a pleasure. For folks who haven't listened to Presidencies yet, you can go to the website, presidenciespodcast.com. I'm available on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Threads and Instagram as Presidencies Podcast. And I hope for those who haven't listened yet that you will check out Presidencies. Join us on this wild and wonderful journey through all the twists and turns of American presidential history. Believe me, There are some characters coming up ahead.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. And I'll be sure to link all of the social media content when we launch this episode. But again, thank you so much, Jerry. I really appreciate it. And to all my listeners out there, if you're not already a major super fan of Presidencies like I am, I highly, highly recommend you check it out. Yes, Jerry does very long episodes, but they are engaging and fascinating. And he tells such a compelling story of our past. And I cannot recommend it enough. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
And there you have it. Another big thanks to my friend Jerry for coming on to the show. If you want to learn more about him and his work, head on over to presidenciespodcast.com. You won't be disappointed. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.